Welcome everybody to this ASCL event, wherever you are, close and far, in cyberspace, unfortunately this year. As chair of the ASCL's Researchers Assembly, I am much honored by Professor Karyn Janssen's willingness to deliver the 2020 annual Stephen Ellis Lecture at the ASC, the 7th so far. It is, as you all know, dedicated to the memory of the late Professor Stephen Ellis, a former prominent Africanist at our center. I also especially welcome Professor Harry Tahar. Harry and I are responsible for reflecting on candidates for this lecture every year. And this year we were remarkably quick and unanimous in choosing Professor Karyn Janssen. Professor Janssen is a distinguished professor of education at Stellenbosch University, South Africa, and president of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He holds a PhD from Stanford University. He is an educational curriculum theorist. His research is broadly concerned with the politics of knowledge and, of course, educational issues. He is a prolific author, and his most recent books include South African Schooling, The Enigma of Inequality, Who Gets In and Why, The Politics of Admission in South Africa's Elite Schools, and Learning Under Lockdown, The Voices of South Africa's Children, turning into the problem we are all facing right now, the lockdown, the corona. Professor Janssen is a major voice in the debate on South Africa's educational systems and also in academic and public debate on post-apartheid society. He has 5 honorary doctorates, honorary degrees in the field of education studies. He has done also many lectures and publications on the much talked about and problematic theme of the decolonization of knowledge, now prevalent in African studies as well, of course. Here he has shown to be a highly original and stimulating voice that questions easy assumptions and ideological conclusions in this debate. Last year, in 2019, Professor Janssen edited a very interesting collection entitled Decolonization in Universities, The Politics of Knowledge. His current research includes a national study on the impact of the corona pandemic on academic work of women scholars. And this brings us, of course, to today. As you saw, his title today is The Unmasking of South African Politics and Education in the Wake of COVID-19. I note here that after the lecture, which he will give now in a couple of minutes, I will moderate a question and answer session. It's best if you start posing your questions after the lecture in the chat, and I will then read the questions in their order of entry. We have time for this until 8 p.m. I'm sure that you all will regret as much as I do that we can't have the post-lecture social get-together with drinks, etc. But yeah, that's life in Corona times. We'll again do it virtually, so to speak. Professor Janssen, very much welcome. I'm so glad you are here. The floor, or rather the screen, is now yours.
Thank you very much. I'll take the screen. What an incredible honor to be with you this evening. And as usual, when I speak to my Dutch friends and colleagues with lectures, I normally start with a lighter moment. And I normally take the direct flight from Cape Town to Amsterdam, to Schiphol, because it's so convenient overnight. And I remember coming back home from Schiphol, sitting there in KLM, and the air hostess came towards me and said, "Oh, Mr. Janssen, that's a very Dutch name." And I said to her, "Yes, that's because 300 years ago, your people visited Cape Town in South Africa, where I was born." And she said to me, I hope it was a pleasurable visit. I said, "That's exactly why I'm on this plane." So it is an absolute delight, and I will draw connections to our pleasurable visits and unpleasurable visits in the course of this evening's lecture. We are here to honor, of course, one of the greatest scholars, in my view, of African studies, who left an indelible mark on African scholarship in subjects ranging from organized crime in Nigeria to the politics of exile in South Africa. And from his early years, Africa was, for Stephen Ellis, a personal and a professional commitment. At the age of 18, he was a teacher in Cameroon, and his doctoral work, published as a famous book, was on Madagascar, where he also served as a lecturer at the University of Madagascar. It was, of course, a matter of great pride for many South Africans who knew his work when Stephen was appointed as the Desmond Tutu Professor at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. So for all these reasons, this is just an incredible honor for me to be here. And no story of Stephen can be complete without acknowledging his wife, friend, and intellectual partner in African studies, Professor Harry Tahar, a world-renowned expert in her own right on religious traditions in Africa. One of their famous books done jointly is, of course, Worlds of Power, Religious Thought and Political Practice in Africa. And I would like to thank Harry for the enormous privilege of being able to deliver the 7th Stephen Ellis Lecture at this renowned Center for African Studies in the world today. I've not yet been to Leiden. It was always a dream of mine, so I'm sorry I can't be there, but I do want to acknowledge my surgeon here, doctor in Cape Town, Ian Lorimer. He is an amazing man, very a saint actually in so many ways. And his daughter, I was visiting the doctor the other day, and he told me his daughter, Shannon, is one of your students. I just couldn't believe the coincidence, the wonderful coincidence. I hope you treat Shannon with that typical Dutch care and compassion as I experience with her father. Now, I have a confession to make, colleagues. I changed my topic. I was going to speak about the post-apartheid education legacy, exposed or unmasked, I suppose, by COVID-19. But this is what happens when you ask somebody like me to give a title months before the actual lecture. My problem is I start thinking and so on. So bear with me, please. And my apologies if you came because of the abstract. I'm happy to send you that paper, which I have subsequently put aside. What I will deliver tonight, though, has to do with another pressing concern in the present, and that is the reawakening of decolonization in the public consciousness from Europe to North America and, of course, Southern Africa. And in this respect, I want to do a big shout out to my colleagues at ASC Leiden for the timeliness of next month's Africa 2020 conference, titled Africa Knows. It is a courageous act to ask of the Netherlands itself about its own complicities in the colonial project and the enduring legacies of that history within the present, as far as the politics of knowledge is concerned. And that indeed is my theme this evening, the politics of knowledge. I will hold as a reference point and indeed conclude with a reference to Stephen's remarkable inaugural lecture of 2009 at the University of Amsterdam, which was titled South Africa and the Decolonization of the Mind. If you haven't read that paper, I strongly recommend that lecture because it ends with an unexpected twist. But let us take a step back to reflect briefly on two momentous and interrelated events of recent times. The one event in 2015 was the singular act of a postgraduate student throwing a bucket of human excrement on the statue of the imperialist Cecil John Rhodes, whose bronze memorial enjoyed prominence on the upper campus of the University of Cape Town. Weeks later, the statue fell and was removed from the campus. That single act of human defiance sparked an intense period of protest across university campuses in South Africa and inspired decolonization moments in other parts of the world, notably at Oxford University in the United Kingdom. The second event was the extrajudicial murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, when a white policeman dug his knee into the soft tissue of the neck of the black man for 7 minutes and 46 seconds. The man died shortly afterwards. That single act of human depravity re-energized the Black Lives Matter movement, bringing down Confederate statues in the American South, the statue of slaveholders Edward Colston in Bristol and Robert Milligan in London, and the statues of King Leopold II, such as the one in Antwerp in Belgium. I want to, however, limit my focus to the South African moment with decolonization in 2015 and do a deeper analysis of what happened there, why it happened, and what the event might mean for Dutch-South African relationships in research and development. I begin by sharing the results of a 5-year study on the decolonization of the curriculum done jointly by myself and a colleague, Dr. Cyril Walters, and I believe she is online this evening, with a book on the subject that will hopefully be in print in 2021. The focus was on how decolonization was taken up in the curricula of South African universities, and the title of that book is The Decolonization of Knowledge, Radical Ideas, and the Settled Curriculum. Now, to begin with, South Africa did not represent, as you know, the classical model of the colonial state, as Stephen Ellis so deftly outlined in his inaugural address, referring to the Pan-African chronology of transition from colonial rule. The Dutch and British settlers became natives, and since 1910, with Union, South Africa was a self-governing dominion with uneasy ties to the colonial authority. And in 1961, as you know, declared itself an independent republic. Just before then, the principal liberation movement, the African National Congress of Nelson Mandela, declared through its Freedom Charter that, and I quote, South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white, end of quote. There was, of course, pushback against this flattening role of citizenship. One argument was that South Africa could be described as a state as colonialism of a special type, an invented expression, as Stephen Ellis correctly called it. While another formulation held that apartheid was simply a generic form of the colonial state in Africa, Mamdani in particular. Those analytical efforts notwithstanding, neither CST or the generic form arguments carried much weight in the broader public or political consciousness about what it means to be a South African. As a result, South Africa never did raise in its long history of resistance politics the language of decolonization. Protests were banned as anti-apartheid, including in your country, but never anti-colonial. Education activism came with many resistance labels, from alternative education to anti-apartheid education to education for liberation, and for a brief moment in the mid-80s, liberation before education, but never decolonization. It was therefore a complete surprise that in the 2015 protests, decolonization would be invoked as the language of resistance on campuses around South Africa. Cyril and I found 3 reasons for this. 1, decolonization was selected as the antidote to transformation, which since the 1990s had become the post-apartheid government's language for change. But the country was, of course, and still is, mired in corruption, deepening inequalities, and a very real struggle for affordable access to higher education. Since transformation did not crack these problems, decolonization became the language of replacement. Number two, decolonization was chosen because it invoked among students a language of nostalgia from times when the threat was more tangible, the colonial government, and the solutions much simpler: eject the foreign power from African soil, as in the 1960s and 70s. It did not surprise, therefore, that the writings of choice among activist students were those of anti-colonial fighters like Fanon in Algeria, and decolonization activists like Wachiongo in Kenya. But a third reason for the choice of decolonization, despite its lack of history, so to speak, in South Africa, was that at least in its Latin American derivations as decoloniality, it gave activists an undiluted language of lament. The world was divided into good and evil, the colonizer and the colonized, the global north and the global south, the West and the rest of us. Nothing better characterizes this literature than its repetitiveness, marked by the recitation of old laments. But they nevertheless provide a hard line of distinctions that served the political cause. But since decolonization was invoked as primarily a political instrument in the student struggles of 2015 onwards, there was relatively little attention to its educational consequences. That is, how exactly would the politics of decolonization translate into, for example, the decolonizing of knowledge in universities? Now, given the overriding focus on decolonization as a political strategy, there was little investment in defining what decolonization could mean for changing the curriculum. And I use a very, not so conventional definition of curriculum here, as the encoded forms of knowledge sanctioned within institutions. As a result of this, academic teachers, lecturers, professors made up their own meanings for decolonization because there was no central conception of any kind. Some saw decolonization as meaning remediation in the form of academic development, which in South Africa means trying to close the gap, mainly for Black students, between a poor school education and the demands of university education. Others saw it simply as good teaching, that is, making assessment fairer or adjusting timetables to accommodate students who travel, things like that. And more than a few saw the uses of African examples here and there as itself satisfying the demand for the decolonization of knowledge. The crucial point here is that radical interpretations of decolonization that were supposed to deal with issues of power, inequality, authority, oppression, and injustice were scuttled in favor of these politics-like interpretations of a potentially powerful intervention in the university curriculum. Now, to be sure, there were academics who did bring more radical interpretations to the curriculum change project, but these initiatives existed prior to the rupture of 2015 and remained on the margins of institutional life. In our book, we call these Enclave curricula. They're there, not many of them, but they're not mainstream at all. So most academics gave their own meanings to decolonization in ways that fit comfortably, first of all, with what was within their capacities, such as remediating knowledge, and within their ideologies, such as conserving knowledge. Now, with respect to the interpretations of decolonization within people's ideological comfort zones, I want to use one very interesting example which is called Indigenous Knowledge Systems, or IKS, to make the point. Now consider a book just published in South Africa titled The Decolonization of the Curriculum Project, The Affordances of Indigenous Knowledge for Self-Directed Learning. On its cover, the cover of this book is the apartheid Bushman, who's now named the San. Its authors, mainly from historically white Afrikaans universities, write with a very familiar condescension and paternalism about indigenous actors, and constantly draw firm distinctions between Western knowledge, e.g., the individualistic knowledge, the philosophy of Northwest University, the old Potchefstroom University, and the relational ontology, as they call it, of the San Code. Now, this is a seductive interpretation of decolonization, given the obvious need to recognize, in a more emancipatory context, the suppression of indigenous knowledges, such as reflected in new fields like ethnobotany or ethnomathematics. This, however, I must warn you, is something else. It is the continuation of an apartheid epistemology that lays emphasis on the ethno, that is, the racial and ethnic differences in the cultural production of knowledge, as distinct from white knowledge. In these accounts, white knowledge is advanced, and indigenous knowledge is singularly presented in, quote, primitive forms. There is no reference in these IKS stories to the suppression of indigenous people, let alone the early genocides of indigenous people in Southern Africa, or the exploitation of their knowledge, such as the deployment of the SAN by the apartheid military intelligence, about which people, anthropologists like Robert Gordon, have written extensively, let alone the indigenous properties of white knowledge, or the common bonds of knowledge across racial and ethnic divides. What you have instead is a gross romanticization of indigenous knowledge outside of critical readings of their racialized histories, politics, economics, and anthropologies that subjugated first peoples. This is what someone called domesticating decolonization, where guilt is relieved, complicity disavowed, and where power relations remain unaddressed. Given these rather shaky starting points, what does decolonization look like in South Africa today? That is, has the curriculum across universities been decolonized in any significant way? Now, before I share what we found, another important point needs to be made. When decolonization marched onto South African university campuses in 2015, it seemed as if all the planets were aligned for a powerful impact on institutions and on the curriculum in particular. For example, it was a national student protest movement. It had a clear and compelling cause: decolonize universities, in which the composition, that is mainly white professors, the content, that is European-dominated curricula, and the cultures, that is the institutional cultures, were unchanged, or at least so it was claimed, since the democratic transition of the middle 1990s. What also helped the moment was that there was a university leadership in South Africa that responded with speed and agility to these very pressing demands on the doorstep. Almost all universities set up task teams, mostly under the governance of the Senate, to make sense of decolonization and to present plans for implementing this potentially radical idea. Resources were set aside. Seminars and symposia were convened. Consultations were undertaken. speakers were brought in from all over the world, including the Netherlands, and especially the Latin American scholars. And in the end, commissioned reports were delivered by these task teams to each of the vice chancellor. So here's the question. 5 years later, what does the picture look like? And I'm sad to tell you, nothing really much has changed. Our research found that the university curriculum prior to the revolt of the students looks more or less the same today as it did 5 years ago. The physics curriculum looks the same. The urban planning curriculum hasn't changed much. The theology curriculum is more or less the same as it was before. And the question, of course, is why? I want to suggest, based on our work, a few reasons. First of all, the decolonization movement was primarily a political moment concerned more about broader social discontents in the country, and that was reflected on campuses in things such as the prohibitive costs of higher education, inadequate student accommodation, and the like. As a political moment, its primary production was in the form of the political spectacle. Those routines of protest in South Africa concerned with the dramatic public performances of discontent, primarily political. There was little sustained deliberation on the question of how to achieve deep change in institutions, and in particular, changes in the curriculum. Change, it seems, was supposed to happen by virtue of the sheer force of moral arguments for decolonization, if not as a result of the direct pressure of the political activists themselves. And just to give you a sense of this, estimations now are that the damage to buildings, to computer labs, to libraries, to lecture halls was something of the order of just short of R1 billion. In South Africa, that's a lot of money, okay? And it was as if this, as I said, the sheer physical, very often masculine force of protest was supposed to change your mind. What the activists also didn't reckon with was the political management of the crisis by university leaders in South Africa. So university leaders typically would outwit and outweight the student protests, even while observing the political spectacle. And as soon as the pressure subsided, universities would return to what the feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed so usefully calls institutional as usual. The initial reaction was a form of institutional posturing. That is the pretense that you were concerned, the pretense that you were going to do real change, the real fear that if roads came down in such a dramatic public way, we might be next. And so leaders often reacted by not just trying to do the right thing, but to be seen to be trying to do the right thing in response to unprecedented pressure for change. And then crucially, if I had more time, I could speak about this for a few hours. The activist agenda did not grapple with the power of institutions, not organizations, of institutions to maintain the status quo. Let me mention a few of those things that we explore in much more detail in our book. The very complex set of regulatory agencies that govern knowledge, the bureaucratic processes of institutional compliance with preset standards, the approvals regime for sanctioning new curricula, what in South African bureaucratic talk is called programs, And indeed, the socialization of most academics, of traditional academics, within their disciplines. And so to think that simply announcing change is going to cause all of these different inertial factors, as a Dutch scholar calls it, to suddenly disappear is, of course, naive in the extreme, and so on. And that is why the picture today, certainly in terms of the politics of knowledge, looks more or less the same as it did before. What does this experience of the radical change project mean for the prospects of decolonizing knowledge or decolonizing curriculum in universities? Let me share 4 implications. That, first of all, the project of radical curriculum change requires deliberation, requires leadership, and a long-term strategy for embedding deep changes within institutions. And I use the word institutions again, deliberately. That the project requires reframing the curriculum change project as a broadly critical approach to change, rather than one narrowed down to the limiting language from the past, the language of decolonization. In this view, the hard distinctions of North-South or European-African must be regarded as antiquated and indeed anachronistic for describing cross-border knowledge relationships in the 21st century. Secondly, a second implication, that the resuscitation of a 1960s dependency framework view of knowledge and power has 2 principal limitations. It places Africans in the position of perpetual victims, and it misrecognizes the many ways in which research statuses in cross-border collaborations have changed. And here are 3, for me, very, very powerful examples that I have also written about recently in one of our books. Bongani Mayosi was, until his tragic suicide recently, the head of health sciences, professor of medicine at the University of Cape Town. His PhD is from Oxford. He's a world leader in the study of something that doesn't happen very much in the West, and that is the study of poverty, the relationship between poverty and cardiovascular disease. He brings, by defining his research question within the African context, he brings people who don't normally study that kind of relationship from other parts of the world, from Asia, from Europe, from North America. They send their postgraduate students, they send their professors to study with and alongside, and in some cases under, Bongani Mayosi as a world leader in South African terms, an A-rated researcher, and so on. Bongani is not a victim of some, whipping force in the knowledge financial complex in the West. That would be insulting. That would be nonsense, in fact. He is a leader who brings into the African context people from all over in order for them to study something that is very much defined by local conditions. I interviewed him just before he died, and I had no idea that he would take his own life. And I remember him saying to me, and the professors on this program will recognize what I'm saying. He says, sometimes I'll spend up to 2 years just trying to get the right research problem, just to frame the question right. Because if you get that wrong, almost everything else, is secondary, and so on. And here is a world leader, okay, located by training in different parts of the West, but whose work, whose self-definition is very much African at its core, and so on. A second example I want to mention is a professor at my previous university University of the Free State, called Ian Vermister. Ian Vermister is a world leader in the study of African mining histories, particularly in Zimbabwe and Zambia. Ian, here's something very, very interesting. One of the major inflows of people coming to study alongside and with and under Ian Vermister are academics from those universities that used to be called polytechnics in the UK. Okay, new universities, in other words. They come to study, to learn from, to work alongside this African scholar on African mining histories. Again, the point I want to make is not that Ian, as a South African, hasn't spent time in his own training at places in the United Kingdom, but that as a person who produces leading scholars, young scholars, who become leading scholars from both African countries and from countries in the West, okay, changes our thinking about this North-South kind of, rigidity in our understanding of research and knowledge production in particular. And then let me just mention, perhaps in the context of our current crisis around the world, HIV/AIDS and infectious diseases more broadly. Two of the world leaders right now are in this field in South Africa are Professor Slim Abdul Karim and his partner, Professor Kwarisha Abdul Karim. They are world leaders in studying HIV/AIDS in the context of poverty from their base in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. They have become, Slim in particular, alongside people like Professor Shabir Mahdi at Wits University, Professor Glenda Gray at the Medical Research Council and others, they have become leaders in the world in the study of COVID-19 and its implications in places like South Africa, where comorbidities are sky high, and in particular, challenges such as tuberculosis. And Slim, for example, just recently won a very prestigious world prize, which was awarded to two people at the same time, himself and no less a figure than Dr. Anthony Fauci, the infectious diseases specialist in the United States. What's my point? The world has changed. And that therefore one has to understand knowledge relationships in a very different way than what the decolonization activists would like us to believe. It means, as Stephen Ellis correctly called it, a decolonization of the mind by Europeans as much as by Africans. We need to see each other differently, compose our problems collaboratively, and assume authority for research leadership jointly. The fact that money comes primarily from the North, that is a hard economic reality, should not mean the intellectual subjugation of research or researchers from the South. This means that African, or for that matter, Asian, Latin American scholars must be much more assertive in this new era and not subject themselves to self-inflicted wounds using the language of victimhood from a bygone era. And it does mean that European scholars must, and here I will give Stephen the last word, and I quote, draw data from outside Europe, respect the authority of thinkers in other traditions, appreciate the ways in which others see the world, and cease believing almost instinctively that ideas emanating from Africa must be wrong. This will break the habit of decades, even centuries. Thank you very much.